I want to talk about a couple of things today which I've been working on for quite a few years and which I probably will still be working on for a few years. One of them is the measurement of vocabulary size, and the other is how you provide a balanced vocabulary development program. I'm giving this talk because Hugh Jarvis of the University of Salford wants to put this talk on his website, tsolacademic.org. I'm interested in vocabulary size because this is a way of setting the goals of language learners, both first language learners and second language learners. It's useful to know how much vocabulary people who are native speakers know, and it's useful to know how much vocabulary second language learners need to know. Because of this, I've spent quite a few years working on the vocabulary size test, and that test is now available. It's available free on my website, and it measures vocabulary up to the 14th 1,000 words. My goal is to end up with a test which measures vocabulary size up to the 20th 1,000 words, and possibly even further, because it's likely that native speakers have vocabulary sizes which are much larger than that. It's quite difficult to develop such a test because the methodology for choosing words to go into vocabulary tests is one which has had a very bad history. Probably for the last 80 or so, or even 90 years, the methodology for choosing what vocabulary to test has been a very faulty methodology, and as a result, the tests and their results which do exist don't really mean very much. In the 1920s, the great educational psychologist Edward Thorndike could see some of the problems which were involved in choosing vocabulary for tests. In those days, they used to choose from dictionaries, and so they used to make a random sample of, say, the first word on every 5th page of a dictionary in order to get a representative sample of the dictionary. But there's lots of sampling problems involved with this, and this method of sampling leads to an over-representation of high-frequency words in the sample, and as high-frequency words are usually better known than low-frequency words, then this means that the tests are easier than they should be, and learners' vocab sizes come out to be larger than they really are. Thorndike saw all of these problems, and he wrote an article about it in the 1920s. I think 1924, and it was called The Vocabularies of School Pupils, and it was published in a very obscure place, just a collection of readings. And because nobody read that article, the research in the field went the wrong way for about 80 years or so, committing all the methodological mistakes that Thorndike could see in the 1920s. Nowadays, when we try to develop a vocab size test, we're more likely now to start from word frequency lists than from a dictionary. And so to some degree, these methodological problems are avoided. The vocabulary size test, which is on my website, is based on a selection from 14 1,000 word lists based on the British National Corpus. And the idea is learners sit the test, and because each word on the test represents 100 words, you simply multiply their score by 100 to get their vocabulary size. There's some really interesting findings with vocabulary, partly coming from the results of that test and partly from the earlier research. The general rule of thumb up to now has been, for a native speaker, 1 year of life usually means about 1,000 words. So if you're a native speaker of English, 12 or 13 years old, you probably know somewhere about 10, 11,000 words. It's interesting that beyond about the 20th thousand, it's quite hard to measure vocabulary growth. And so we don't know with adult native speakers whether their vocabulary size is growing at this continuous rate of 1,000 words or not. It's highly unlikely that it is. And it's interesting to think of the reasons why there might be some sort of drop in vocabulary growth around the ages of 20, 25, something like that. One reason is that it could be that by the age of 20, 25, you're over the hill and you can't learn anything more with any great success, and so that's why your vocab growth doesn't seem to increase. From my perspective, that's a completely unacceptable explanation. Anybody who's in my classes has to follow rule number 1, and rule number 1 is respect old things. And so we can't use old age then as an explanation for a seeming lack of vocab growth. Another reason might be that once you know around about 18, 19, 20,000 words, you very rarely meet new words, and if you do meet them, you don't get enough repetitions of them to make them stick in your mind. So it could be several years between one meeting of a word and the next meeting of it. So it could be then that repetition and availability of the vocabulary is a factor. This kind of explanation supports the idea that one way in which people might increase their vocab size is to take on a specialist interest. And so that means that if you develop a new technical field of interest, then you'll learn the new vocabulary related to that field, because that vocabulary will be frequent and common when you do work within that field. It's very hard to measure this with vocabulary tests, because it would mean designing a vocabulary test which would tap each major technical field of interest in order to give a reliable result from that. And that's, of course, very difficult to do. With non-native speakers of English, some of the results that are coming out now with the vocabulary size test is that some learners of English seem to have quite large vocabulary sizes. We have done some tests in Korea, and we find that students around the first or second year of university, in a good university, know around about 9,000 words. Now, this is a very large number. And one of the reasons for this quite large vocabulary size is probably because not only are they learning English very effectively, but their first language is also moving closer to English, in the sense that lots of loan words from English are entering into the language. So in the Korean study that we looked at, just about every student knew the word ubiquitous, which is around about the 9th or 10,000 word level. And when a few of them were questioned on how did you know that word, it turned out that ubiquitous was actually a loan word in Korean and is actually used, I think, by a company in Korea as its name, and everybody just happens to know it. So quite a lot of vocabulary knowledge that people have of English vocabulary is coming through their first language. Frank Dalton estimates that the first 3,000 words of English, the most frequent 3,000 words, about half of those are present in Japanese in some form or other. And because they are present in Japanese as loan words, they make the learning of these words much easier. So with vocab size tests, it's interesting to find out how large vocabulary learners have and where this vocabulary comes from. When we look at the demands of novels and newspapers, movies, and academic texts, it seems that in order to cope with in reading such texts or listening to such texts, you need a vocabulary size of around about 8,000 or 9,000 words. This vocabulary size gives you about 98% coverage of the running words in the text. So that means if you come to read a novel and you've got a vocab size of around about 8,000 or 9,000 words, there will only be 2 words per 100 or 6 unknown words per 300 word page to cause you any sort of problem. And this isn't enough to have serious effects on the comprehension of the text. So the kind of way we try to calculate how much vocab people need to do certain jobs is based on the assumption, which is supported by a little bit of research, that people need about 98% coverage of the vocabulary that they meet in any texts that they want to comprehend. Fortunately, there is more research going on about this to see if this 98% figure is something which is true and defensible, or whether the percentage of known words will vary greatly for different kinds of texts. So research on vocab size then is a way of trying to work out how people develop vocabulary knowledge, and also a way of working out what goals they need to reach and how close they are to reaching those goals. The second topic I want to talk about is related to this, and that is, once you find out your learner's vocabulary size by giving them a vocab size test, what do you do about helping them to learn such vocabulary? The approach I like to take is called the 4 strands, and the 4 strands is based on this rather simple principle. It says that if you want to learn vocabulary through a balanced range of opportunities for learning, you need to have opportunity to learn through input, that is, through reading and through listening, where you focus on the message and comprehension of what you're receiving. You need to have the opportunity to learn through output, that is, through speaking and through writing, where you're trying to communicate messages to others. You need to have the opportunity to deliberately learn the vocabulary, to study it, to be taught it, to work with a dictionary on rather difficult texts and to learn it. And you need also the 4th opportunity, which is to develop fluency with what you already know. So the principle of the 4 strands simply says, if you want to have a well-balanced language course, you need to have 4 strands which have equal amounts of time for each strand. So that means about 1/4 of the time on a well-balanced, well-designed course is given to fluency development, where you have nothing new to learn, but you just become good at using what you already know. About 1/4 of the time needs to be spent on deliberate learning. About 1/4 of the time needs to be spent on learning through output, through speaking and writing, having to communicate messages to other people. And about 1/4 of the time needs to be spent on listening and reading, where you meet new words in what you are receiving and you pick up those new words incidentally. But your main focus is actually on receiving messages. It's not too difficult to design courses which have a good balance of the 4 strands. But a good thing that teachers can do is to look at their own course and to try and work out, are they providing a good balance of opportunities for learning? A simple way to do this is just to keep a record of what your learners are doing in class and out of class over a period of a few weeks or a month. And then keep a record of each activity they do and how much time is spent on that activity. Then what you have to do is classify those activities into the 4 strands. Which ones are fluency development activities, because they contain no new or difficult material, but it's just getting the learners to work on stuff at a faster and faster rate. Which activities are those involving input and output, where the focus is on communicating messages, on communication activities, and which activities in the course are language-focused, deliberate learning activities. And then you look to see, do you have a roughly equal balance of each of those 4 strands in the course? Probably the biggest or most difficult decisions to make when trying to do this kind of classification is deciding how do you allocate a certain amount to input and how do you allocate a certain amount to output, because when learners are doing, say, a group speaking activity, when one learner is speaking, it is output for that learner, but the other learners who are listening are gaining input. And so for each individual you sort of need a slightly different calculation. Another quite tricky decision to make is which of the activities are fluency development activities and which are meaning-focused input or output activities. The major criterion should be that for the fluency development activities, the material is really easy. It contains only known language and is often on very familiar topics. And there needs to be some pressure to go faster than they would normally go. Let's look at some of the activities which would occur in each of the 4 strands of a course. If we take the meaning-focused input strand, then a very useful activity is to have a good extensive reading program. This is a program which gets learners to read at least one graded reader every 2 weeks, and preferably one graded reader every week, which is written at a level which is suitable for them. They don't have to do lots of tests or answer questions on the reader. They simply read it for enjoyment, keep a record of what they've read, and then move on to the next reader. Quantity of reading is important. Another activity in the meaning-focused input strand is listening to stories. This is one of my favorite techniques, because when you do it, you can sit down. And the teacher sits down in front of the whiteboard, opens up a graded reader, which is written at a level which is roughly suitable for the learners, and then begins to read them the story, making sure that it's not too fast, that there is repetition of the sentences, and that the learners are engaged with the story. Every so often the teacher will write up a word on the whiteboard which the teacher thinks the learners mightn't recognize, just to help them recognize it. This goes on for just 5, maybe 10 minutes, and then the teacher says, "To be continued," and closes the book, and the next time the class meets, the story continues. After a while, the learners get really caught up in the story, and they want to hear what comes next, and it becomes a really enjoyable activity for them. But it provides them with very good opportunities for meaning-focused input, because their focus is strongly on the message. If you want to know some good books to read to learners, then you should look at the Extensive Reading Foundation website, the Extensive Reading Foundation, because each year this website has the winners of the graded readers competition at all different proficiency levels. And there you can find the best graded readers which have been written and published in that year. The meaning-focused output strand involves learners doing communication activities like ranking activities, problem-solving activities, retelling activities, and so on, where their focus is on communicating a message. Writing activities also fit into the output strand, where learners have to push themselves to write about things which are just at the level of their knowledge. They might have to occasionally consult a dictionary and get some help, but the main thing is to just keep having to produce language. A very important principle for those two strands of meaning-focused input and meaning-focused output is called the time-on-task principle. The time-on-task principle simply says, if you want to learn how to do something, do a lot of it. So if you want to learn how to listen, do lots of listening. If you want to learn how to read, do lots of reading. If you want to learn how to write, do lots of writing. It's a very crude principle, but it's one that always works. You don't get good at reading or listening by not doing much reading or listening. And so one of the ways of making sure that the meaning-focused input and output strands are working well is to make sure that the learners are getting lots of input and producing lots of output. It's even worthwhile setting some kind of quantity goals in terms of number of words produced and number of words read in order to make sure that there is plenty of input and output. In the deliberate learning strand, a very useful activity, which is often seen to be unfashionable but is always very effective, is learning words from word cards. That is, the learners carry around little packs of cards about this size, with the word or the phrase they want to learn on one side and its translation in the first language on the other. This is an extremely effective technique with well over 100 years of research showing its effectiveness. Very recently, there's been research which has shown that this kind of learning not only relates in what's called explicit knowledge, but also results in implicit knowledge. That is, knowledge which is subconscious, fluent, and well integrated with the knowledge system. So this means that when learners do this kind of deliberate learning from word cards, they are developing the kind of knowledge that they need for normal language use. They need other kinds of knowledge as well for normal language use. But this kind of deliberate vocabulary learning is a very, very effective way of quickly increasing vocabulary size so that learners can get up to the thousands of words they need to know in order to be able to cope with unsimplified texts. Other deliberate learning activities include intensive reading, where the teacher and the learners work together through rather difficult texts with explanation about the difficult vocabulary and the grammatical features of the text and so on. Doing vocabulary exercises, so working with books which deliberately set out to teach vocabulary. A very good one on academic vocabulary is Norbert and Diane Schmidt's book, I think it's called Focus on Vocabulary, which is a really good way of having to learn the academic word list. People criticize deliberate learning, saying that it doesn't help in normal use. The research shows that the kind of knowledge that deliberate learning develops is the kind of knowledge needed for normal language use. And so that criticism is no longer supportable. Deliberate learning should only make up 1/4 of the time in the language course. And I feel that a lot of the criticisms of the deliberate learning parts of a course really refer to courses where too much time is spent on deliberate learning. That is, where it goes well beyond 1/4 of the class time. The fourth strand of fluency development involves activities like speed reading. Okay, there's a speed reading course available free on my website, written at the 1,000 word level, and by doing this course, learners can increase their reading speed by at least 50% and often double their reading speed. This involves an investment of time of only about 5 or 10 minutes each session, and the learners need to do about 20 or so sessions. Fluency development needs to occur for each of the 4 skills of listening, speaking, reading and writing. So the speed reading course is a way of developing reading fluency. Another way of developing reading fluency is to get the learners in the extensive reading program to read really easy graded readers, but to read them fast. Listening fluency. The activity that I mentioned of listening to a story eventually becomes a fluency development activity, because by the time the teacher gets about halfway through reading the story over 2 or 3 weeks to the learners are so familiar with the plot and the characters and the vocabulary involved in the story that the later parts of the story really become fluency development activities. Recent technology has made the development of listening fluency a much more interesting prospect. Digital tape recorders now allow the user to speed up the playback of a recording so that it can be a little bit faster than it was recorded, or quite a bit faster than it was recorded, and the language doesn't sound distorted. This seems to me great for developing listening fluency, because you could take the CD, which comes with a graded reader, load it onto your tape recorder, your digital tape recorder, and then play it back at a slightly faster speed, and then try it again at a slightly faster speed again, so that you can now listen faster and faster. In the past, people used to say, oh, my listening fluency isn't that good, and so the teacher could give rather sarcastic advice and say, well, try listening faster. Nowadays, you can try listening faster by making use of this technology. Writing. A way of developing writing fluency is to use an activity which is called 10-minute writing, where learners spend 10 minutes, exactly 10 minutes, 2 or 3 times a week, just writing about things that they know a lot about, but trying to write as much as they can in that 10-minute period. At the end of the 10 minutes, they count up the number of words that they've written and put them on a graph. And their goal is to make the graph go up. People like Steve Herder have done research on 10-minute writing and find that it brings about very useful increases in writing fluency. I'm sure that when more research is done on this, you'll find, as we found with speaking fluency research, that not only does fluency development result in increased speed, it also results in a reduction in hesitations, an increase in accuracy, and also an increase in complexity of the language used. This is because once you get on top of the ideas that you're trying to deal with, it's much easier then to give attention to the more difficult formal features of what you're dealing with. Speaking fluency. My favorite activity for speaking fluency is called 432, a very simple activity. What happens is you put the learners in pairs, so they're all sitting in pairs, one learner A, one learner B. Everybody who's learner A talks to learner B for 4 minutes on a very easy topic. It's a topic that the teacher has either chosen for them, or one that they've prepared beforehand, or that is based on reading they've already done. But it has to be easy for them. So the teacher says, "Are you ready? Go." And then learner A talks to learner B for 4 minutes about that topic. Learner B sits there looking interested, but doesn't ask questions and doesn't interrupt. At the end of 4 minutes, the teacher says, "Stop, change partners," and everybody who is learner A moves one seat along, and then the teacher says, "Are you ready? Go." And now they have 3 minutes to give exactly the same talk to their new partner. At the end of 3 minutes, they stop, change partners, and learner A gives the talk for the third time, the third successive time, to a new partner, but this time has only 2 minutes in which to present the talk. After this has been done, then learner B can either present their talk, or they can do their talk on the next day that the class meets. This 432 is a very effective speaking fluency development activity. There's a little bit of research done on this, and you can read up the research. If you look at the articles on my website under publications, around the 1980s, you'll find that we did some research on this, looking at the effects of the activity, not only on fluency, but also on other aspects of language knowledge. So a well-balanced language course then has 4 equal strands. They're equal in the amount of time given. It's a strand of meaning-focused input, meaning-focused output, language-focused learning, and fluency development. If you want to make sure that learners are getting a good balance of opportunities for learning, then make sure that each of these strands gets a roughly equal amount of time. By doing this, you can then help your learners reach the vocabulary sizes of 6, 7, 8, 9,000 words, which seem to be necessary in order to be able to deal with unsimplified material. I hope these ideas have been helpful for you. Thank you for your patience.